Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you some examples of the power of the knight. Let's start first with this simple-looking position, which is not quite as simple as it looks. Typically, when a pawn is not that far advanced, it's still 3 squares from the promotion square, it shouldn't be much of a problem to save the game. However, I suggest you try to figure out this position without the help of the computer, maybe with a friend or just by yourself, moving the pieces around, how you should draw this game. If the black pawn would be on b2 right now, and then the white knight could go to a3 or c3, the game would be an easy draw because the black king would not be able to chase the white knight away from all 3 of the important key squares that would guard the b1 square. However, at the moment, black is threatening to move the king to c5 and chase the white knight kind of away from where the action is. For example, if white would play king g3 right now, black's response would be king c5, and then after knight c7, b3, knight e6, and king c4. And now, believe it or not, but white cannot stop the pawn from promoting. By the way, I'd like to point out something very important, namely that when there is a diagonal distance between a king and a knight and 1 square in between, it actually, even though it seems visually close to each other, it would be 3 moves for white to check the black king. So assuming that the black king doesn't move and white keeps moving, it would take white 3 moves to attack the king. And in this case, white can neither attack the king nor reach in time the promotion square of the pawn. Going back to the starting position, let's see what else can we do. If we don't have time to bring our king because it's too slow, then we need to rely on the knight. But what can the poor knight do? It cannot go to a3 or c3 or d4 or d6. So really, we're left with only 2 choices, moving to a7 or c7. Well, certainly of the 2, knight c7 looks more logical. At least it gives a check, doesn't allow black to just so simply advance the pawn. Now, indeed, if the black king would move, let's say, to c5, the white knight would go immediately to a6 and then capture the pawn, and we would solve all our headaches. Game is over. But what happens if the king moves to c4, which is a much better square? Now again, if the knight moves to a6, trying to go after the pawn, obviously black will move it right away before white gives up the knight for black's last pawn. We have again that distance. Remember the diagonal distance between a king and a knight with 1 square in between, when it's almost impossible, or at least takes a tremendous amount of time, to even check the king. So now again, the white knight is stuck. There is no way it can stop timely the black pawn. Also, kind of moving from the other direction to e6 will face the same problem as we've seen formerly. Incredibly, the saving move is going even further away from the pawn. This is one of those exceptions when you see that the shortest road is actually going away from our target. If black right now responds by playing b3, then white would already, of course, come back to d6. And if now the king goes to b4, again creating this diagonal distance with 1 square in between the king and the knight, then white already in time arrives on e4 and then on d2, controlling the key promotion square. And after king c3, knight b1, king c2, knight a3, king b3, and so on, and black cannot make progress. Going back to this key position after knight e8, let's see what happens if after b3 and knight d6, the king moves rather to d3. Then the knight catches the pawn from b5 and then a3. Okay, this is so far so good. But what happens if in this position black makes also a tricky move and plays king c5, not allowing the white knight to get to d6? Well, then the knight will have to come from the other side, from f6. If b3, knight e4, the knight reaches one of the three key squares that control the b1 square, and it's game over, it's a draw. What happens if now on the third move, black plays king d4, cutting the knight out? Amazingly, the knight needs to go back again to e8. And again, if b3, then knight d6, b2. But how are we catching that promotion square? Did we miss a move? No, we did not. And this is a very important motive that white is gaining the time now by giving a check. And then on the following move, just on time, the knight arrives on a3 and on to b1. And as we know, this is a theoretical drawn position. Going back again to the position after the fourth move, knight e8. If the king moves to e5 again, trying to keep the white knight away both from the d6 and f6 squares, the knight is back on c7 after b3, knight b5, or after king d6, knight e8, and the game is a draw. A very nice example on the power of the knight. Let's see another endgame when, in this case, black has two passed pawns. And unfortunately, white cannot count much on his own king because it's so far away from the action from catching either of the black pawns. In this position, white needs to be extremely careful, make a lot of only moves in order to save the game. Again, as usual, try to figure out on your own what those moves may be. If the white knight makes kind of a casual move back to e2, the black king will just advance and then the pawns will just march down one by one. For example, moves like this, and then the g-pawn will just proceed. If the knight moves to h5, also black will push the pawn. After knight f6, keep pushing it. Knight g4, blocking both pawns, but then the king will come to help. And go to e4 and king f4, chasing the white knight out, and again resulting in an easily winning position for black. So what may be the solution? It's quite impressive. Knight moves to e6, actually chasing the black pawn. The pawn advances, and we chase the pawn again. Quite amazing. Pawn advances. And we chase the pawn further. The pawn cannot be protected. If the g-pawn advances, then knight takes pawn on f4. So the pawn needs to advance again to f3, and even further chasing. Now, if the f-pawn advances, seems like the pawn promotes, another very common trick in such endgames, then we can allow the pawn to get promoted, because right after it promotes, an immediate fork arrives and black loses the newly born queen. On the other hand, what would happen if black advances further the g pawn? Then we again continue attacking the pawn, and after g2, check, and then we capture the pawn, and in fact we reach an identical position as we had in the previous example, just on the other side of the board. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are, getting harder and harder. In our first example, we had one pawn against the knight. Then in the second one, we had two pawns for the knight. And in this one, we actually have three black pawns for the knight. And all of them are passed pawns. In fact, one of them just one square away from promotion. White's first move in this position is quite obvious, otherwise the black pawn gets promoted. So white must play king c2. And black's move is also pretty forced. The pawn on b2 is hanging, so black must connect the a and b pawns not to lose it. And now we have a very interesting scenario, because the black pawns on a3 and b2 on one hand block white's a2 pawn and also tie down the white king in stopping the b pawn from promoting. On the other side of the board, we have two black pawns that are not connected, that the knight is holding up. So far so good. The king holds up the b passed pawn and the knight holds up both the e and g pawns. The problem is that black at the same time has a free range king. That king can just come closer and closer and closer and aid those two passed pawns on the king's side and win, isn't it? Well, not so simple, but that's the challenge. How to save the game for white. Well, white plays knight e3, black plays king b7, and white plays knight g4, blockading those pawns. And king c6. And now comes the amazing moment in the game. Knight e5 check. It seems that it's just inviting the black king to help his own pawns. However, black actually cannot pass through the d file. Pretty amazing. If at any stage the king would go to d8, there would be a fork with knight f7 winning the pawn on g5. The same would arise if the king would go to d6 or at a later stage d4. There would be a fork from f3. But how about if the king actually goes to d5? If the king goes to d5, then again, similarly to the last example, white is able to keep attacking a pawn and then win one of the pawns. Namely, attack the pawn, the king is too far to protect it, again attack the pawn, and again attack the pawn, and here comes the fork. Very impressive. After white wins the pawn on g2, of course, the game is easily a draw. Even if white will end up giving up the knight for the e pawn, it's still a theoretical drawn possession. Let's go back to this moment. After knight g4, king c6, knight e5, how should white continue if black just plays king c5 for now? This is a very important moment because the knight needs to remain on e5. Otherwise, there will be no fork if the black king arrives on d4. So therefore, white needs to make a waiting move and play king b1 instead. So again, if the king goes to d4 or d6, there will be a fork winning the pawn on g5. But how about king b4 now, the king trying to come to c3? Then white would just play king c2. Okay, so how about if instead the black king moves to b5 and after king c2, now king b4. If now white makes the waiting move with king b1, then king c3 and white gets into a Zugzwang, meaning that the king can no longer move. And if the knight moves to, let's say, g4, then the black king got around. Let's go back. And after king b4, this is the moment where white should play knight g4, because now the black king is far away from the d file. And after king c4, the knight is ready to come back. So the bottom line is, as soon as the black king is on the c file, the knight needs to go back to e5. In other places, white has time to make waiting moves with king c2 and king b1. A pretty amazing position worth remembering. Let's see the following position. Here we go. Well, this is a different situation for a change. White actually is playing for a win. The problem is we have even material and very little of it. In fact, if black would not have the pawn on h7, typically positions like this would be also a draw. However, in this very particular position, because black is so passive, white is able to win. As you can see, the black knight can be extremely limited. Look at this solution. King f7. Black gives a check, and white plays king f8. The poor black knight has no other choice but moving back. White plays knight g4, limiting the black knight to its passive position on g8 and forcing black to play h6. King f7, the black knight still has no move. King h7. The question is, how can white make progress? Well, let's try knight e5, king h8, and now knight g6, king h7, knight f8, king h8. This is all nice and dandy if it were black to move in this position, but he's not. We just gave the check, the king just moved out of it. How do we make progress? Even if white would, for example, go and attack the pawn on h6 with the knight and the king, and then capture it and trade knights, the game would be, of course, a draw. So the question is actually how to win this endgame. Let's go back to this position that we had a few moves ago and see what's the correct plan. I suggest you try to figure it out on your own before you listen to the solution. At the moment, we need to reposition the knight. Knight c4. Black is completely on the wait. The knight is stuck, so black can just go back and forth with the king. We positioned the knight to e8, so the king will be limited to the squares on the h file and cannot escape on g7 after the next king move. And now we'll see the famous king triangulation. White needs to lose a move in order to achieve the Zugzwang position we talked about a minute ago. King d6, and now king d7. White successfully triangled and lost the tempo on purpose, and we're back in this position with the white knight being on a light colored square. And now the knight can go back towards f8, and here we are in Zugzwang. It's amazing how the maneuvering, it took 16 moves to achieve this, but black really had no choice because all the squares from the knight were taken away, and the king's position, of course, was also very limited. Another very important lesson we learned through this endgame is that knights cannot lose a tempo. Unlike A pawn may, if it's still in its initial position, or a king can, a bishop can, rook can, knights cannot. So therefore, the loss of tempo needed to be done by the king with the so-called triangulation. And finally, let's see our last example, which is actually from a famous game, but it also could be called the Jewel of the Week. Here we are. It starts out like a very normal position, and in fact it is white who is a pawn ahead. However, because black has a far advanced pass pawn and the white knight is in an unfortunate far away position, it is white who is certainly under pressure to try to save the game. And it's also black's turn, which does not help white's case. Black needs to advance the pawn as soon as possible, which he did. He played d3, threatening to simply promote the pawn. White has no choice but try to catch it and run with the king as soon as possible. Now, if black immediately would push the pawn ahead, white would arrive just on time to e2 and be okay. But black can do better with a tricky move by playing knight c3. On one hand, this takes away the e2 square from the white king, so therefore right now d2 is a very immediate and very serious threat. It also takes away the retreat square of the knight on b5. So this is a typical multi-purpose and very strong move. White's only choice is to play king to e1 to prevent the pawn from advancing further and promoting. And now we're using again the king as an attacking piece, moving it forward to d4. The threat right now is very clear. For example, after knight c6, the black king would arrive to e3 and white would be helpless against the two checks and promoting the pawn to a queen. White naturally can do better and play king d2, preventing the black king arriving to e3 and the promotion, or at least the immediate promotion, of the pawn. But black can chase the king out for now. King back to e1. And now black played knight d6, again preventing the knight from coming to b5. If now knight c6 comes, then king c3. For example, knight e2, d2, king d1, knight e4, threatening knight f2 check, knight d5, king c4, attacking the knight, a very important move. And when the knight goes away, so there is no check when the black king arrives to d3. Let's go back again. The game continued with king d2, and the knight now came from c4. King c1, d2 advances, king c2, king e3. Now the king is threatening to come from e2, and white is trying to catch the pawn with knight b5. So if king e2, knight c3, white is hanging on. But now came the beautiful move, knight a3 check. This is called deflection, deflecting the knight from its plan, going to c3, giving a knight up, but it allows king e2 and now no knight c3 check, and the pawn is unstoppable. A very beautiful endgame. Hope you enjoyed it. Well, we learned a lot about knights in this lesson. That knights are very tricky pieces, the only pieces that jump, and sometimes going in the opposite direction is the closest direction, the closest route to get to your target. I suggest you listen again to this lesson to understand even deeper the messages I mentioned. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.